Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Dacey. I'm the Executive Director of the Sign Institute at the American University. We're so excited that you're joining us today for an incredible program. First of all, I'd like to thank Anita McBride, who is on our advisory board, for bringing this incredible opportunity to us. Today, we're going to be discussing an American University speech that was a commencement speech on June 10th, 1963. It was titled A Strategy of Peace, and it was an address delivered by the United States President John F. Kennedy at the American University. It was delivered at the height of his rhetorical powers and widely considered one of his most powerful speeches. And we're so lucky today to have three individuals with us who will give us their perspectives, not only personally from the opportunities they've had in this field, but also for people who have researched in this area. Let me start by saying that we're happy to have Andrew Cohen, who is a scholar and the author of a book called 2 Days in June, John F. Kennedy and the 48 Hours That Made History. This incredible book talks about this speech specifically. We're going to make sure that you have plenty of information to get this book. It's incredible accounting and goes into deeper depth, but we're so grateful to have you here today, Andrew. We've got Terence Szuplat, who was the former Deputy Director of Speechwriting for President Barack Obama. So we have our very own speechwriter in-house. And also Bill McGurn, who is the former Chief Speechwriter for George W. Bush. So I think we'll have some interesting perspectives from both of them serving in two different administrations about the powerful impact that a presidential speech can have. I also just want to point out that Terry is a proud alumni and a proud Eagle, and so we're happy to have him join us as well from that perspective. I think it would be best to just start out, gentlemen, with kind of an overall perspective that each of you have, whether it's about the speech specifically or speech writing and what it means for a president. Andrew, it's so exciting that you wrote specifically about this book, about this speech in your book. And I'm very interested, you had to research it. Were you on campus? Like, what were your overall perspectives as you dug in deeper to the meaning of this speech, and especially during the time and who it was meant to influence?
Well, thank you very much, Amy. Perhaps I could just begin with a little context for the speech. It's June of 1963. John F. Kennedy is 2.5 years into his abbreviated presidency. The event which perhaps most influenced the speech was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, of October 1962, when the world came as close to nuclear Armageddon as it has before or since. That was the 13 days in which JFK faced Nikita Khrushchev, and Kennedy and Khrushchev were both shaken by what had happened. Kennedy particularly, he would hear about the casualties that nuclear war could bring America, 80, 90 million dead. And he would say, well, I've lived my life, but I have 2 children. And so that winter, he's trying to change the channel. He is looking for a way, as is Nikita Khrushchev, to break the cycle, to talk in a way they had not talked before. This is, as I say, the height of the Cold War. There was a back channel established through the Pope. Norman Cousins, a prominent American journalist, also was acting on behalf of the Kennedys. Norman Cousins knew Nikita Khrushchev. Kennedy wants to say something very big. And we talk about speeches being merely rhetoric. This wasn't just rhetoric. This speech would lead to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, John F. Kennedy's greatest achievement in foreign policy. The speech, though, that he would give at American University on Reeves Athletic Field on a witheringly hot day, dressed as he was in a heavy gown, he refuses the cap. He is going to get an honorary degree that day. It is a commencement speech. And the Kennedys have gone, I say the Kennedys because Bobby is involved in this as well, they've gone to American University looking for a place for Kennedy to give this set speech, which will be called eventually the peace speech because of what JFK will say. The speech, though, Amy, it's very important to know, was written largely in secret. Kennedy is going to say things that an American president has never said before, or at least of the Soviets that no president has said since Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an ally of Joe Stalin and, of course, the Soviet Union in the Second World War. So it is written over 6 weeks, very carefully. The person who writes it largely is Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's speechwriter. Perhaps he and JFK, to me, represent the most successful partnership over 11 years, which precedes Kennedy's presidency. They shared a mutual love of words and respected each other enormously. Ted could finish Jack Kennedy's sentences. But Kennedy doesn't want a number of elements in the American political sphere to know about the speech. So the CIA is not consulted, the congressional leadership is not consulted, the secretaries of state and defense are only told about the speech 24 hours before, roughly. And so by the time Kennedy steps up to the lectern on Reeves Athletic Field, and it will be a live address to the United States, he has stepped off only 90 minutes or 100 minutes earlier. He stepped off a Air Force One, having flown across the Pacific, across America, to give this speech. His speechwriter had flown out with it. Ted Sorensen had flown out with a copy of it and had flown back on Air Force One with JFK so they could go over it. It was only then telexed to a number of people in the American government. The people Kennedy really doesn't want to see it are the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He thinks the military will not want to hear what he has to say. And Amy, what does he have to say? In brief, he humanizes the Russians in a way that no one had done before. He celebrates their success, their bravery in World War II, but their success, industrial, scientific, cultural. He gives them a stature that no American president, in a time when the rhetoric of Uncle Joe and the Russian bear and nuclear stockpiles and gulags were the way we talked about the Soviet Union, he doesn't use that language. And he spends a good part of that emphasizing the humanity of the Russian people. And then he'll make an offer. He'll talk about, he proposes a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty that had been talked about for probably 2 or 3 years, but had gone really nowhere. Eventually, there will be a partial test ban. So in 2 ways, Kennedy will do 2 interesting things. He'll talk about the Soviets as an American president had not before. And this speech, to show it is not just rhetoric, will produce, as I say, the first of the arms control treaties and what will be the greatest foreign policy achievement of the Kennedy administration.
That's incredible to put that all in context and to help us understand the real weight of this speech and the intent for this. I'm interested, Terry, and welcome back. I know you've done some Science Institute events with us before, so we appreciate it. Andrew mentions flying around on Air Force One, going back and forth, that relationship that Ted Sorensen, certainly had with President Kennedy. I'd love to get your initial, thoughts on this. Do you think speeches still make this kind of impact? I know you also have a personal connection with this speech in some ways.
Sure. I mean, it's every speechwriter's dream to write a speech like this and to try to have a speech and words that you wrote that would be remembered and for decades to come. I think one of the reasons there are speeches like this are so important is because what President Kennedy did at AU was more than just, as he just said, more than just announce a new policy, more than just call for a specific treaty. He did something that when done correctly, is one of the most powerful things that anyone, or particularly a president, can do, and that's to challenge sort of old ways of thinking, to try to get the American people, the world, to think differently about an old problem. And so as you go through the speech, you see over and over again, he uses this phrase, let us examine our attitude. He says it 4 times, let us examine our attitude towards peace. And he talks about how we should think anew about how peace could be possible in the Cold War. He says, let's re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. And that's where he makes these points to try to, humanize, as was said, the Russian people. Let us re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War, the very underpinnings of the struggle we were in. And I think, there were actually 4 parts to this, and we've been talking, so much attention goes to the first 3. The final part was, he said, let's examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. He drew a direct connection. This is the height of the civil rights movement. He drew a direct connection between our security in the world, our role in the world, the values that represent, and what's going on in our own borders. to our own citizens. And obviously, you know, here we are today, 2020, this has a direct relevance to what's going on right now. You know, one line of all the lines that jumped out at me, you know, let us re-examine our attitude towards peace and freedom at home. Peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. So here we are in 2020. Today is the 5 years since the massacre in Charleston. Our country is reeling from the death of George Floyd. And so President Kennedy's words still speak to us. They're still highly relevant today. And so this speech works on all sorts of levels, some of which we don't always fully appreciate. Just from my own personal standpoint, yeah, this speech has always kind of had a special place in my heart. I grew up in Massachusetts, in Falmouth, Massachusetts, down on Cape Cod, where the sort of the Kennedy mystique and the Kennedy family is all around you all the time. Even when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I came to AU. I was aware that Kennedy had given this major speech there. That was part of the appeal, that this is a school that this is a place where leaders come and deliver important policies and pronouncements. It was at AU where I got through my academic advisor, Bob Briggs, who's still at the School of Public Affairs. I was able to get an internship at the White House Speechwriting office for President Bill Clinton. And even though I was only an intern, and when you're an intern, you're doing a lot of thankless tasks, I saw just enough. I fell in love with speechwriting, this idea that you could help a president, you could help craft the words that helps a president speak to the world and speak to the people around the world about what our values are and why we want to be a part of their lives and be a partner with them. And years later, I came back to the White House as a speechwriter for President Obama. And it was during that time that, although I wasn't the lead speechwriter on his AU speech, I joined President Obama when he came back. And so it really felt like to be back at AU with a president, having gone there myself, it was awesome. It was everything coming full circle. And so that just on a personal level, that's what the speech means to me.
I appreciate you sharing that. I'm sure there's a lot of students that are on right now and will listen to this conversation that appreciate knowing that professors, the Career Center, there are opportunities, especially when you come to American University. Bill, I am so excited to hear from you. I'm certainly working for President Bush. I think of so many moments during his administration that had impacts both domestically and internationally. I'm sure you were busy all the time. So I'm very curious to know, like, what your perspectives are of the impact of a speech, how you utilize that in the administration, and your perspectives on how important this is as a means to communicate large ideas. We'll just have you unmute there for a second. Thanks, Bill.
Speechwriter in a Republican administration, it's a little different, but speechwriters are a pretty bipartisan group. I found we have the same predators against us. And one thing we can say is, among all the speechwriters going back, I don't think anyone's ever been convicted of a crime. Not every office in the White House can make the same claim. So that's one of the things that unites us. But I mention this only because I'm actually more as a skeptic of the policy that JFK promulgated to this and instituted in many ways. But as someone, as a speechwriter, I look at it kind of like as a mechanic, leave that aside. I agree with everything my two predecessors just said. And especially, I think Andrew mentioned that Ted Sorensen's relationship with JFK. That's always intrigued me. I, of course, knew of Sorensen before I got to the White House, but when I went there, I read all the speeches that I could. And I've always regarded him as the greatest of presidential speechwriters, not necessarily because of his talents, which were considerable. I knew a lot of writers who were really excellent and probably matched him in that skill. But I think Andrew hit on it, the relationship that he enjoyed with the president enabled him to say things and not have it mangled by the rest of the staff to rebuff some of the claims. If anyone wants to know how a White House works, look at Peggy Noonan's book, and where she talks about the staffing process of you pass the speech around to the White House for corrections, and look at the part where she says how the Gettysburg Address would look if it had to go through staffing. So I think JFK trusted him. And I think Andrew said he could complete his sentences and so forth. He really knew his thoughts. And that's one thing I sometimes found lacking in the better writers, not speechwriters, the better writers. They often would write speeches that were excellent speeches in their voice, but you're trying to capture something congruent with the man who is giving it. And not everyone can do that. And I also found sometimes that the more experienced a writer a speechwriter was, especially in journalism, the less easily it was for him to capture the president's voice. You know, if you're a president and say Kennedy had one term cut short, but if you're president over 2 terms, you probably have 24 speechwriters, right? Very talented people, but you want them all to sound the same. You don't want an up and down and all sorts of different notes. You want them kind of to fit on the same wavelength and so forth. And a lot of times the speechwriting staff, you know, they kind of want to show off what they could do. So I think Kennedy's approach, because it was was much more disciplined, and I think he was able to maintain his insistence on some of the pure language and the simplicity that he might not have been able to do had he not had this extraordinary relationship with the president that preceded JFK moving into the White House.
I find that interesting. I don't know if there's a specific speech that you can remember that you worked on that might have had that interaction like you had, like between the two of you, back and forth from the many speeches you've probably done.
But back and forth with whom?
With the president. I'm just curious if there was one that.
Yeah, I mean, all the presidents are different in their approach. President Bush was very interested in speechwriting. And so we had regular meetings once a week with him, a formal meeting. And then if there was a speech, we might have 3 or 4 a day with him. So he was tough. He had he had taken a course called, I think, American Oratory at Yale, taught by a guy who taught John Kerry and Bill Buckley. And it was a very simple formula. Say what you're going to say, make your 3 points, your peroration, where you can have some purple language, and conclusion. And he wanted that logic in. So he was very, unlike his father, he was very active in the speechwriting process. But for speechwriters, I don't know if the other 2 fellows had the same experience. For speechwriters, like, we liked it when it got to the president. Even if he hated a speech, we liked it because we didn't have to listen to anyone else. You just had to please, and that's easy, to please one person. You're going through the staffing and taking the defense secretary, the secretary of state. I mean, later I was planning to talk about the surge speech, which came in the middle of a mess. And after 2 weeks, the young fellow, Chris Michelle, and I walked into the president's office at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. And the president read it, and he said, page 1 is a disaster. Oh no, page 1 is awful, but it is not the disaster that page 2 is. Not an auspicious start. So the next day when I went to see him Sunday morning at like 6, I said, Mr. President, yesterday you didn't like page 2. Chris and I basically took page 2 out. So if you think of it as page 3, he might go down a lot better. And he just kind of put his glasses down and looked at me. I think my colleagues would have similar experience.
I think that's fascinating. It's interesting because you mentioned about people's influences, on the speech, and Andrew, you mentioned that so much of this was in secret. I mean, there wasn't a lot of input or going to different parts of the administration to get their input. I guess one of my questions would be, this was a commencement address, but who really was the audience for this speech? Because you have to ask if it was, most of it was done in secret, where was the impact? I mean, and it was decided to be done at a commencement speech at a university, but who was the audience of the speech?
Well, the audience was the American people. This was carried live on American radio and I believe on American television. So the audience was the American public, but the target was Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow. And Nikita Khrushchev could not turn on CNN and have an immediate transmission of what was going on. He didn't get the speech for several hours. It had gone through, the text had gone through the Soviet mission at the United Nations and was later, I think, telexed to him. But even in those days, there was no direct link between the White House, the hotline would go in later that summer between Moscow and Washington. But the audience was certainly the American people. And as Terry has just said, in this extraordinary, eloquent appeal to ask them to think differently about peace. And it was Nikita Khrushchev. Just to put a little context, another little bit of context, Amy, in 48 hours, JFK will do 2 such speeches. He'll give 2 such speeches. The next day, he'll give a civil rights speech where he'll ask Americans in much the same way, in much the same spirit of generosity, to see Black Americans differently. And he talks about what it is like to be a Black American in America, or in 1963. So in 2 days and 2 speeches, JFK is pivoting on the 2 biggest issues of his generation, nuclear arms and civil rights. And as Terry has just said, peace and freedom were precisely what he was talking about. And that infuses these 2 days. The next day, Tuesday, June the 11th, George Wallace will stand at the door of the University of Alabama and try and prevent 2 young Black Americans from entering the university. And Kennedy will use that crisis to address the nation that night in almost an extemporaneous speech, written entirely different from the one the day before. And he'll raise the moral questions, he'll use that word 3 times, about civil rights America and how white America should see this emerging reality. So in a sense, these 2 are woven together in ways that nobody would have expected 2 or 3 weeks earlier.
It's fascinating too, the impact of having 2 huge speeches like that in that same, so close together. You mentioned the audience and getting this message overseas, and at that moment in time, how people, were able to receive those. I'm very curious, Bill, in the environment that when you were at the administration, certainly there was more access, for people around the world when you gave a speech. How did you amplify, foreign policy speeches? How did you try and get on the world stage at that moment in time when you think about, this Kennedy speech, and how did they try to get it around the globe? What was the goal of the Bush administration to get these foreign policy speeches widely seen?
Well, we didn't have to try. When I was there the second term, George Bush was a wartime president. So almost every speech was a war speech in some ways, or a foreign policy speech. And as Andrew said, we had a lot of different audiences. One, you had to explain the policy to the American people, but the president would always remind us that we're also speaking to Congress. Again, we're speaking to the average Joe out there, so he knows that what we're doing makes sense, but also to the Congress, to our friends in Congress, our enemies in Congress, to our friends abroad, and also the enemy that's listening in to read clues about where the president is going. One time, a lot of people were pressuring the president to kind of talk personally and say how hard it was to make these decisions in war, and sometimes he's not sure. And I remember he told me, I'm not going to go out there wringing my hand on this. There's some Marine lieutenant out in Fallujah, and he doesn't need his commander-in-chief saying, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. He needs some certainty. So that was one of the things. But we always had a consciousness of foreign, because as a wartime president, most of the speeches we did were war speeches.
That's interesting, especially each administration has a different context in those years and what the, what the real focus was. And so how you did that. I have to say, Terry, though, you were a speechwriter who was during an administration where social media came to the forefront. And I'm very curious about how the onslaught of social media and the internet, did it change the delivery or even the way you write speeches because of how people consume content, how it's passed around? This is a whole new dynamic for your administration, for both domestic and foreign policy speeches also.
I think we can all agree that social media has been wonderful for our democracy. Barack Obama was the first president to send a tweet. He, during his campaign and his presidency, made incredible use of Facebook and YouTube. We can debate, we could probably do a whole nother session on whether whether presidents being active on Twitter was the right way to go. certainly in the last few years. But, you know, I've always thought that, you know, when you go back to JFK's speech, you know, and Andrew, you probably have a better sense of this than I do, but, you know, there's three major television networks, 3 nightly news broadcasts, you know, national radio programs, and then maybe you get a morning newspaper. That was how the American people experienced a presidential speech. I don't know if the AU speech was broadcast in full on the networks. Maybe it was. I suspect it probably wasn't. So it was, you know, maybe you could get it reprinted in your newspaper at some point, but most Americans, I don't think, had the opportunity to experience a presidential speech the way we do today. Now, it is true that we have, you know, endless numbers of networks and channels and cable networks and media outlets and social media platforms. What, in my mind, that does is you can, you know, take a speech, chop it up into little snippets, and little clips go out across just the universe, all these different platforms. And what that does is it brings the speech to more people who then on their own, if they want to, can choose to sit down at their leisure when it works for them and watch the whole speech on YouTube, on the, you know, on whitehouse.gov, you know, on Facebook, what have you. And so I would hope and I would think that more people today are experiencing presidential speeches than ever before, you know, whether it's extended clips or even in their entirety. Now, there are, I think that's a good thing. I think that's a great thing. I think that when a student, you know, who's interested in politics can do that in a way that previous generations couldn't, that's a phenomenal learning experience. When someone on the other side of the world can jump on their phone and listen to the speech of an American president, where they don't have to go through, you know, the censors if they live in under oppressive regime, where they don't have to go through the filter of other news channels in their countries. It's a wonderful thing. And, you know, I don't think it changed, just I can speak for myself and our team, I don't think it changed how we wrote speeches, how we thought about speeches, because in the end, a speech is a very unique form of writing. It's not an article to be read quietly when your morning coffee. It's not an essay in a magazine. You know, it's a performance. It's a script. It's the script for the interaction between a living, breathing human being and their living, breathing audience. And so you think about the speech in its entirety, and you want it to have a coherent whole and a coherent narrative arc, and you want it to have a beginning and a middle and end and have it hold through together. That's something you can't get on little clips, but it is something that, thanks to social media, if you're interested to, you can experience that.
Well, it brings up an interesting question, because here at the Science Institute of Policy and Politics, we talk about how every sector has influence on the policy-making process. And so we talk about the public sector, private sector, nonprofits, journalism, and then also academia and how they influence it. So, you know, I'm interested to know, Andrew, it seemed after 12 days of negotiations and less than 2 months after this speech, the partial nuclear test ban treaty was completed. So was the intent of this speech to set up for this policy proposal to get through? Was it to create awareness, or was it to really drive some messaging that would have to get into this treaty?
Well, a little of both. JFK felt he had to make an extraordinary appeal on Nikita Khrushchev. He felt he had to do it quickly. He had proposed, as I say, a comprehensive test ban treaty. Khrushchev wasn't ready to do that. But what is interesting is, having given the speech, it was Khrushchev's reception. Khrushchev said, "No one has talked about us like that since the Second World War." It has always been the cold, harsh rhetoric of the Cold War. And Khrushchev, who had a sentimental side, who cried when Kennedy was killed, who went to the American embassy to sign the Book of Condolences, this had been his enemy 7 months earlier, felt to a degree touched by what Kennedy had said. Now, it didn't mean he was going to bargain any less hard, and it didn't mean that the shaping that treaty was going to be any less easy. It was going to be hard. Kennedy sends Averell Harriman immediately to Moscow, and it doesn't take very long for that treaty to emerge. But I think Kennedy here is understanding that he also had to lay the groundwork at home. He had to prepare the American people, who, after all, from that president himself, had heard that kind of rhetoric. Robert McNamara pointedly said once that if you really wanted to understand the evolution of John F. Kennedy, don't go to the inaugural address, which is hawkish and very much reflective of the big issue of the Cold War pressing down upon JFK in January of 1961. He said, go to what was then called, what would be called later, the peace speech. It didn't emerge, by the way, as the peace speech for several years afterwards. But it was there that McNamara and John Kenneth Galbraith and those who honored Kennedy said, that's the Kennedy we knew, but it took him a while to get there. And so rhetoric, in a rhetorical presidency, you see that evolution. And again, as I said earlier, you saw it the next night as well on race.
It is interesting that was, both those speeches were back to back. Obviously, big policies came out of that. I'm wondering, Bill, is there a similar example of when President Bush used a speech to help drive and get support around a certain policy that he was committed to? Is there a good example of one that certainly the speech was a leverage that was used to try and get this policy initiative passed during his administration?
Well, as I say, I joined the day before he was sworn in for his second term. So we were fully within the war. The war hadn't quite gone sour yet. That was around the time of the elections and the purple fingers and so forth. So there's still some optimism. It got a lot uglier. But I would say almost every speech of President Bush was designed to get something through. Not as big as the treaty, a treaty on nuclear weapons, but usually war funding. I mean, one of the more important speeches was after Mrs. Pelosi took office and so forth. The president made his case for war funding, which a lot of Democrats didn't want to do, and he went to the people, and I think he prevailed. That wasn't it wasn't a famous speech or anything, but most of his were directed at support for the war. I mean, the one that I was involved in the most that was like that was the surge speech. This was written in the worst time of the war. You woke up every day, there's 15 Marines killed in some town. There are a dozen Shia kids have been beheaded, or the opposite, some Sunni girls have been molested. Every day was a disaster. And that was where I learned that speeches really are policy. I mean, I don't know, my colleagues were probably a lot more sophisticated than I was. But when I went to the White House, I was a draftee. I wasn't a volunteer. I was a newspaper man, and I am a newspaper man. And when I went, I didn't even know the Oval Office was, in the White House. I thought it was in the West Wing. I mean, I didn't know any of these things. And I thought when these guys do speeches, someone produces a glossy brochure with all the PhDs weighing in, and then you just put it together with words. And what I didn't realize is policy speeches are really like duct tape and baling wire. You put it all together, and then you try to make it coherent. And that's what the surge speech was. The worst part of the war, even the conservatives just wanted, let's go home, let's get out of there, it's a disaster. And no one wanted to hear, including the Pentagon, the president asked for more people. I think the speech holds up very well. But going back to something Andrew said, he didn't quite say it as literally as I'm going to say it. But I think if you're talking about a great speech, what makes it? A lot of speechwriters kind of overestimate their own contributions. Speeches are very important, and conveying to the American people, that's very important for language. But I think to make a great speech, one, the language has to be consistent with the person giving it. You really have to have his voice. The American people are judging his sincerity. It really has to sound like that person, not that he's reading from somebody else's script. Second, I think it has to be on an issue that's a big moment, as the nuclear treaty was in Kennedy's time, where the surge was in Bush's time. And third, I think the president giving it, he has to be taking some kind of risk. If he's just saying something that everyone wants, I don't think there's any risk to it. He has to be doing something different. I used to always remind the speechwriters. I mean, two different instances I'll give you as an anecdote. Once in the White House mess, someone was complaining the war was not going well, and the tendency is to blame the messenger, the speechwriters, right? And I remember saying to them quite probably a more testy tone than I should have. You give me a better war, I'll give you a better speech, right? You can't tell the American people we're winning when they see we're not winning and all. A lot of people think words can overcome reality, and I don't think that that's true. The other is people think that if the words are so great, everyone's going to remember them. You know, with Iraq, I used to remind people, no one reads the Vietnam speeches of LBJ if you didn't win. You know, so, you know, there's a lot of external circumstances that go into it as well. But again, my time was probably different because when there's a war and Americans in uniform are being killed every day, that takes over almost everything in a White House.
Yeah, I can imagine the context of what you were dealing with at the time. You know, it's interesting. I wonder, Terry, in a virtual world, what role does a foreign policy speech play in diplomacy? And do you view, you know, utility of a speech differently, you know, when things are so accessible and public and things, you know, exist in this way? Is it used differently now that we're in a virtual world to try and influence? I mean, it was interesting, Andrew, what you were saying, certainly about Khrushchev and being one of the main audiences for this and his reaction, but I'm just wondering, you know, how a virtual world will affect that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it affects it too much. I mean, when a president gives a speech, whether they give it in 1963 or 2013, the whole you're always speaking to the whole world. Your adversaries are listening, your allies are listening, the American people are listening, your critics are listening. When Andrew talked about how a primary audience for JFK's speech was Khrushchev. Well, when an American president goes and stands in Seoul, South Korea, a primary audience is the North Korean regime. When President Obama went to the Baltic states after the invasion of Ukraine and gave a speech about NATO and our obligations to defend our allies, I mean, primary audience of that speech was Vladimir Putin. So I think one of the things that's always been true, it's even more true now, is that when a president speaks, the whole world is listening. Yeah. And so you have multiple audiences all the time. Just going back to your previous question, a speech to persuade, a speech to announce new policy. I mean, I think of Barack Obama's 2015 speech at American University. And it was almost like the inverse of Kennedy and 1963, right? So that speech in 63 was a direct reaction to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came to the brink of nuclear war. He's going to try to set out a new path towards peace. In 2015, Barack Obama comes to American University with the potential for war with Iran over its nuclear program looming. And he, in a very lengthy speech, makes the case for the Iran nuclear deal, which he felt was the best way to avoid a war with Iran. And if you look at that speech in August 2015, he not only quotes at the beginning, keying directly off JFK's speech at AU, he comes back to it at the end. But there are so many parallels throughout to JFK's speech. The emphasis on the need to talk with your enemies, to engage with your enemies, because you can only make peace with your enemies, not your allies. The importance of diplomacy, the importance of an international order upheld by institutions like the United Nations, the importance of diplomacy, the importance of not rushing to war. Again, going back to this idea of challenging a mindset that says military action is the first or only way to deal with a complicated problem. So that's a great example where just like Kennedy said, I want to send a signal to Khrushchev, I want to signal a new course. President Obama goes to American University to make the case to the world, but specifically to Congress, which the following months had to actually vote on the deal and had the potential to kill it. So, I mean, I would encourage students listening, that'd be a great exercise. Read the Kennedy speech, read other speeches, read the Obama speech of 2015, compare and contrast. You'll see a lot of similarities there. And that's not surprising. I'm sure Bill can attest to this too. This dirty secret of speechwriting is the first thing a speechwriter does when they have to write a speech is they go and they read all the other speeches that other presidents have written on that topic or in that place. If your president's going to Berlin, guess which speeches, the first thing we do is we go back and read all the speeches that presidents have given, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, tear down this wall, because you recognize that the speech you're about to write is going to be, the next chapter in a book. It's going to be the latest chapter in an ongoing story. And so there is a reason that there are themes throughout that are consistent president to president, even as maybe the president's party and ideology differs so vastly.
It's interesting. I know, Andrew, you said when asked who the audience, was, you said the American people. One thing that in doing some research on this, I found that it was after 1 week, only about 896 letters, I think, were actually sent to the White House concerning its content. How did the Kennedy administration know that this speech made an impact on people? I mean, were they able to gauge that the American people embraced this, heard this? Especially with the speech the next day too, there was such an impact they were trying to make with the American people.
Well, Kennedy noted that the one way you could test reaction in those days was the volume of mail. And Kennedy noted quite sardonically that there had been a rail strike and there was going to be a freight rate increase, and that got far more a reaction than his peace speech. The civil rights speech, though, and interesting, when Terry talks about precedents, when Ted Sorensen goes to write that speech, he has 2 hours to write it, and he had no precedent whatsoever. He had to draw from his experience at the University of Nebraska as an exponent of civil rights in the late 1950s to give that speech a certain context. And that speech it did have a reaction immediately. The peace speech did not. As I say, it was not called the peace speech till later on. It grew. Its stature grew in the digest of speeches and the hierarchy of speeches, but immediately, Kennedy, there was something of a shrug. There were, later on, the Manchester Guardian called it one of the great texts of American foreign policy. 2 or 3 weeks later, editorialists did. Others reliably, like the Wall Street Journal, did not endorse the speech at all, thought it was not that great, and didn't think a test ban treaty was that smart a move. And there were people in Congress who felt the same. 2 speeches in 2 days, entirely different reaction. And then, by the way, we just mentioned Berlin. Ted Sorensen, by the way, is very busy that month. He not only wrote those 2 speeches, he wrote the one that Kennedy, largely, but not wholly, that Kennedy would give in Berlin later in June that month. That speech had immediate reaction too. But the peace speech of the 3 probably had the least reaction, but historically has gone on to have a life of its own.
It's interesting, the initial impact versus the long term. So I have to ask our speechwriters, both Bill, you and Terry, how did you measure if a speech had impact? How did you know if, the words that you put on the page and what the president went out and said was having an impact? Bill, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure. Well, look, we frequently had a specific goal. As I said, a lot of times it was war funding or some approval. So a lot of that is when the approval came through or something went through. Again, the surge speech was interesting because nobody liked it. Nobody wanted to hear more truth. And how many people, including, I believe, Barack Obama, predicted it would fail. And then it succeeded so quickly, right? Now, maybe overturned today and so forth. But that's the judgment of whether it succeeds. I think, look, with President Kennedy, he got a treaty. That's a big deal. So, it's an achievement. But I do agree that sometimes you don't know the impact until later in history. I mean, to go beyond the presidents we worked for, I remember President Reagan when he spoke at Notre Dame right after he was elected. Now, Jimmy Carter had given a speech there talking about getting over our inordinate fear of communism. And everyone was expecting Reagan to kind of give it back really hard. And he gave a speech saying the last days of communism, the last pages are now being written. And a lot of the hawks were disappointed, but that holds up very well today. But at the time, even the hawks didn't like it. They thought it kind of lacked teeth and so forth. But, history has a way of highlighting certain things and downplaying other things, which is why it's always interesting to go back and read them in light of what we know followed.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the story about the letters. People still write letters. Barack Obama would get 10 letters a night, read them. Oftentimes we would get copies of them. when someone took the time to write to the president or write to the White House to react to something that he had said, a speech, write an email, write a letter, there's no greater tribute to a speech than the fact that, you know, again, you're in the White House, you're writing all these speeches all the time. The president is sort of, you know, sending them out into the universe, and you just don't know how they land so much. You know, Washington journalists may or may not react as you expect, but days later, weeks later, months later, to know that there was somebody out there who heard those words and that it resonated with them somehow, that is how you know that you've touched a chord in someone. I mean, just from a personal experience, I wrote a speech once on for President Obama on human rights and civil society. You know, it was a you know, it wasn't a huge speech. It didn't get a lot of attention at the time, but months later, someone told me that they had met a human rights activist in Egypt who had printed the speech out and carried it around with them in their coat pocket with them everywhere they went, because it reminded them what they do and why they do it. And I thought, wow, that's something that I had worked on, something that the president had said, had given someone who I will never meet some hope, some strength, some fortitude to carry on doing what they're doing. You know, and we're lucky enough when those messages get back to us, but most of the time they don't. We know they're out there. We know that on travel, sometimes I hear people, you know, quote presidential speeches back to you. So you know when it comes back to you that it has resonated with people, and people carry these speeches in their heart when they speak to something that's universal, when they speak to something not just country specific or issue specific or policy specific, but some very core human values that people share all over the world. When you hear that come back to you, that's how you know a speech has resonated.
Great. Well, thank you. I know we've got a couple questions. I want to get some final thoughts from each of you. A reminder to everybody on here, 2 days in June, John at JFK and the 48 Hours That Made History, a very important book. We encourage you, we'll give you the information as well to make sure that you dive deeper into this. So Andrew, let me ask you this. Final thoughts. I'm very curious what made you want to even write about this speech, how it came to you, but would love you to share some final thoughts before we get some of our audience questions.
Well, as an observer of JFK all my life, both as a journalist and as a student and as a professor, I wanted to find a way into the Kennedy story that would be different from the memoirs, the biographies, the probably 1,000 books which have been written about the Kennedy administration. I wanted to find a way in, and I thought rhetoric was a way in, and I came across these 2 days in which, as I say, JFK pivots enormously, but also there's a certain morality here that Kennedy is seeing. He's understanding that the world as he knows it is changing, and he wants to get ahead of that. And on the two issues that are bearing down on him and will shape the decade, will shape his generation, nuclear arms and civil rights, he actually can make a difference to the power of rhetoric if the rhetoric is matched with achievement. So as I say, it's not just rhetoric, and the forgettable speeches that people make are sometimes very pretty words that are not attached to anything. In JFK's case, what was attached to it was a real breakthrough in the stalemate between the Soviet Union and America, and Kennedy foresaw. He saw working with the Soviets in space. He wanted to take peace even farther. And then, of course, and there was the treaty, and then, of course, on race. What I didn't say earlier was he proposed that night in that 13-minute speech, which is extemporaneous for the last 2 minutes because he doesn't have a finished text. He proposes the Civil Rights Act of 1963. It will not be of 1963. It will be 1964, a landmark in American legislative history.
Well, it's incredible. Thank you so much. We've let the audience know certainly about the book. We love your thoughts on this. Andrew, I'm very excited to bring you personally to campus when we can be back on to share your thoughts and get you actually at the location where the speech happened. Last thoughts, Bill, just in general about, you know, the impact of speeches.
Yeah, no, I think speeches, the more successful presidents realize that communicating your ideas and your agenda successfully to the American people is very important. And you from my talk with speechwriters of different administrations, presidents treated their speechwriters very differently. I think among Republicans, George W. Bush and Reagan treated them very seriously. I'm not sure the others did. And they all do it very differently. I don't think you could write a JFK speech for George H.W. Bush or a Reagan speech maybe for Bill Clinton. They're all different people, and they have different skills and different talents. Let me end on just an anecdote about the slight sort of grudges we had. The two most unpopular speeches in the Bush administration were the United Nations General Assembly, because you ended up talking about ministerial meetings and so forth. The audience is largely hostile, so they don't cheer the diplomats from all the other countries. So one year we just decided, when the president was speaking, and instead of just saying, I have this plan and I'm inviting you to join me and so forth, we said, let's try where he looks at someone and just talk over the head of the representative there to the people. So you just say, to the people of Iran, we have no quarrel with you with this. And the president told me later he sort of enjoyed it because, again, this is a speech where you get no reaction from the people, because he started seeing some of these guys squirm, wondering who was going to be next, where he's going to talk over. And then on a lighter note, that was called the UNGA speech, United Nations General Assembly. The other terrible day for speechwriters is St. Patrick's Day. I'm not sure Andrew and Terry had this, but when I was in the White House, there were 3 events on St. Patrick's Day. I think the Irish Taoiseach came and exchanged shamrocks. There was a reception for Irish Americans there, and then there was a reception on Capitol Hill. So 3 different speeches. And I can tell you, as someone that got there later, going back to Kennedy's speeches, and the bottom of the barrel had been scraped. There are no tales about St. Patrick, driving the snakes out. There's nothing left. So that was one of the more grim tasks, to say something cheerful on St. Patrick's Day.
Terry?
Sure. I guess, one of the reasons I love speechwriting so much is that, there are 300 million Americans. Most of us will never meet a president. Most of us will never be in the same room as a president. But we've all heard speeches. And a presidential speech is sort of this bridge that connects the president and the citizens. It's how most people, most citizens, most Americans experience their president. Yeah, we can watch videos of the meetings and that sort of thing, but it's that one moment when the most powerful person in the world is speaking directly to you about the issue of the day. And I just think that just from a democratic standpoint, from an American standpoint, if you want to understand America, if you want to participate in our democracy, this is the connection that connects the highest leader in the land with the ordinary citizen. And I think as a speechwriter, what's so awesome is you get to be the person to help connect those two people. And because you are also one of those people, you're also writing for yourself. I'm a speechwriter, but I'm also a citizen. I'm also a voter. I'm also an American. What is it that I would hope the president would say in such a moment? Moments of triumph and tragedy and crisis. The job of a speechwriter is often, we joke, kind of the job as a translator. You get to sit in these meetings, sit in a situation room, sit in the Oval Office, surrounded by some of the leading experts in the world on whatever the issue is of the day. And everyone agrees, everyone's smart, everyone agrees that the president has to now go out to the American people and articulate what the room feels, what the president feels. You as the speechwriter get to be that translator. You get to pull in the history, the poetry, the issues of the moment. And you get to help tell that story. You get to help write that script for that experience between the president and the citizen. That's one of the things that I've always loved about speechwriting. That's one of the great things about JFK's speech, is that here he was speaking on the most complex, complicated issue of the day to all sorts of people, but ultimately to the American people. And that's what every speech does.
It's incredible. I know we've got a lot of questions. I think we have time for only one, so I'm going to make it a good one. But there were some questions definitely about tactics in speech writing and best practices. Bill, Terry, if you don't mind, I might come back to you, and maybe there's some things, ideas that we could share with the students, or we could have you back talking to them about career paths and you know, specifics on tactics. We'd love to be able to do that. So I know there's a lot of interest in that. But we did have a question from Val that's quite timely. He asked specifically about, you know, if Vice President Biden's elected. I will add if Trump, you know, is reelected. The world is watching right now. And so whoever was to give that first foreign policy speech, you know, after the election, any thoughts about what is the most, you know, what should they focus on? What's the most important thing to have an impact today? Just a light little question for all of you.
I can jump in real quick. I mean, obviously, if Trump were reelected, I think we have, you know, 4 or 5 years of examples. We kind of know what his message is going to be. But I think if there's, you know, if Joe Biden is elected, then like any new president, it'll be really important for him to give not just one speech, but a series of speeches that really demarcate his administration. And on the foreign policy side, I think, you know, there have been, you know, the last few years have seen sort of a withering of our alliances, a withering of global institutions. President Trump has said very, very directly at the United Nations, at the youngest speech that Bill talked about, that format, you know, most recently he said, you know, the future does not belong to globalists. You know, he very proudly declares himself a nationalist. So I think, you know, for a President Biden in January, February, March, it'll be incredibly important for him to signal to the world, again, our allies, our adversaries, that frankly, the United States is back, that we're actually going to participate in these institutions that undergird the peace and security of the world, and that we're going to be a partner with countries that have felt that we haven't been a partner. So I think it'll be a really important, that'll be one of the major tasks that he faces if he's elected.
Andrew, Bill, thoughts on?
Yeah, I agree. Look, there's going to be big differences. You know, the irony is, though President Trump has a record now, we can see the outlines of, you know, he definitely wants to bring troops home and so forth. Is suspicious of alliances, suspicious of multilateral trade deals and so forth. So he has a record of 4 years. Joe Biden has a record of many years as a senator. He prides himself on foreign policy. So I think even before one of them is elected in January and gives a speech, I think it's going to be a significant part of the debate for the presidency. I think they have very, very different visions, and I think those are going to come out, and it'll be interesting to see not only how each side defines himself, but how they try to define the other side.
Any thoughts, Andrew?
I would agree with my two colleagues. I would just say that it'll be an opportunity, if it's President Biden, to announce that America is back and that America has embraced the world again, whether it's on climate change or COVID or collective security or international or international trade. I would think that there would be a great opportunity for then, if it is President Biden, to enunciate that America will return to the international stage, will reassure its allies that it's back. And I imagine if it's President Trump, he will, as Terry has said, he will simply repeat more of the same. So there will be whoever gives that speech there'll be two distinctive views of America and the world offered by next January.
Well, we look forward to finding out what that speech is going to be so we can analyze that together. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your time today and for your expertise. Again, we encourage you all to get Andrew's book. This event has been recorded and will be available on the Sign Institute's YouTube channel in a couple of days. If you enjoyed the program today, we encourage you to stay involved with the Sign Institute, go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. But I am telling you right now, I'm going to certainly welcome all of you back to campus. We'll find a way to have you back and share some of your expertise. And Andrew, we're looking forward to seeing what your next project is as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.